Secret history. Before the Templars. The hidden bloodline that ruled Europe. Have you ever wondered why certain European royal dynasties seem to possess an almost mystical authority that went far beyond mere political power? Why their subjects didn't just obey them, but revered them as if they carried something divine in their very blood? What if I told you that before the famous Knights Templar, before Charlemagne's empire, before the rise of medieval Christendom as we know it, there existed a dynasty so powerful, so spiritually significant that their very existence threatened to rewrite the foundations of European civilization? Today, we're diving into one of history's most carefully buried secrets. A bloodline that ruled vast territories across what is now France, Belgium, and Germany for over 3 centuries. Kings who never cut their hair because they believed it contained their sacred power. Rulers who claimed not just divine right, but divine blood. A dynasty that was systematically erased from history so thoroughly that most people have never even heard their name. But their story didn't end with their fall from power. It went underground, protected by secret societies, encoded in symbols, and whispered through the corridors of medieval monasteries. From the mysterious Knights Templar to the enigmatic Freemasons. From the hidden vaults of the Vatican to the coded paintings of Leonardo da Vinci. This bloodline's influence can be traced through 1,000 years of European history. This is the story of the Merovingians, the forgotten dynasty whose secret has been guarded for over 13 centuries. And by the end of this series, you'll understand why their truth was considered so dangerous that it had to be buried beneath layers of legend, myth, and carefully constructed lies. Let's begin in the mist-shrouded forests of 7th century France, where our story opens not with a coronation, but with a murder. The year was 679 AD. Deep in the Ardennes forest along an ancient Roman road that had seen the passage of legions and barbarian hordes alike, a hunting party moved through the morning mist. Among them rode Dagobert II, King of Australia, wrapped in a cloak of royal blue. His presence commanded respect not just from his retinue, but from the very landscape itself. This was no ordinary monarch. Dagobert represented the culmination of a dynasty that had ruled these lands for centuries. The Merovingians claimed descent not from mere mortal kings, but from something far more ancient and sacred. They were the long-haired kings, the sacred bloodline that traced their authority not to Rome or any earthly power, but to the divine itself. But on this cold morning in the Ardennes, that sacred lineage was about to face its greatest test. As the hunting party moved deeper into the forest, they were unaware that they were walking into a trap that had been years in the making. A conspiracy that reached from the highest levels of the Frankish nobility to the inner circles of the church itself. The assassination when it came was swift and brutal. A spear through the eye, some chronicles say. Others claim it was a knife to the throat. The exact method matters less than the result. Dagobert II, the last truly independent Merovingian king, lay dead in the forest dirt, his sacred blood seeping into the earth of the realm he had ruled. But here's where the story becomes truly mysterious. In the aftermath of Dagobert's murder, something unprecedented happened. The chronicler stopped writing not just about the assassination but about the entire Merovingian dynasty. It was as if history itself had been instructed to forget. This wasn't just political assassination. This was historical erasure on a scale rarely seen in the medieval world. Within a generation, the Merovingians had been transformed from sacred kings into footnotes. Their symbols were repurposed, their tombs forgotten, their very names scrubbed from the official records. To understand why Dagobert's death mattered so much, we need to step back and examine what made the Merovingians different from every other dynasty in European history. These weren't typical medieval kings who ruled through force of arms or political cunning. They claimed something far more dangerous. They claimed to be sacred by birth. The Merovingian dynasty traced its origins to a semi-legendary figure, known as Mevec, from whom they took their name. According to their own traditions, Meve was born of a supernatural union. his lineage stretching back not just to earthly royalty, but to the divine realm itself. This wasn't mere propaganda or royal mythology. The Merovingians genuinely believed and taught their subjects to believe that they carried sacred blood in their veins. This belief manifested in practices that set them apart from all other European rulers. Most famously, Merovingian kings never cut their hair. This wasn't a fashion choice or a cultural quirk. In their understanding, their long hair was the physical vessel of their spiritual power. To cut a Merovingian's hair was to strip him of his divine authority, to sever his connection to the sacred realm from which his power flowed. The ritual importance of their hair was so profound that when enemies wanted to depose a Merovingian king, they didn't need to kill him. They simply had to shear him. A trimmed Merovingian was no longer considered capable of rule. The hair carried not just symbolic meaning, but actual spiritual authority. But the long hair was just the most visible sign of a deeper difference. The Merovingians ruled through what they called divine sanction. But this wasn't the same concept that later medieval kings would claim. They weren't crowned by bishops or invested by the Pope. Their authority came from within, from the sacred blood that flowed through their veins. Contemporary accounts describe Merovingian kings as possessing supernatural abilities. They were said to have prophetic dreams, the power to heal by touch, and an almost mystical connection to the land they ruled. Their subjects didn't just obey them, they venerated them as semi-divine beings walking among mortals. This created a unique form of kingship that had more in common with ancient priest-kings than with the feudal monarchies that would later dominate Europe. The Merovingians were simultaneously temporal rulers and spiritual authorities, earthly kings who claimed direct connection to the divine realm. Their conversion to Christianity under Clovis I in 496 AD only deepened this mystique. The baptism of Clovis was described in chronicles as a miraculous event with holy oil descending from heaven carried by a dove. This wasn't just a political conversion. It was portrayed as divine confirmation of the Merovingian bloodline's sacred nature. But here's where the story becomes complex. While the Merovingians embraced Christianity, they did so on their own terms. They incorporated Christian symbolism and ritual into their existing understanding of sacred kingship, creating a unique synthesis that made them both Christian rulers and something else entirely. Their Christianity was tinged with elements that made church authorities uncomfortable. They maintained practices that seemed to hark back to pre-Christian traditions. Their understanding of their own divine nature didn't always align with Orthodox Christian teaching about the relationship between earthly rulers and heavenly authority. The symbols associated with the Merovingians tell their own story. Golden bees found in their tombs and incorporated into their royal regalia represented immortality and resurrection. The fleur-de-lis, which would later become the symbol of French royalty, may have originated as a Merovingian emblem, representing the union of earthly and divine power. These weren't mere decorative elements in the symbolic language of the time. They were declarations of identity and authority. The bee in particular carried profound meaning in ancient traditions representing the soul's journey between mortal and divine realms. For the Merovingians to adopt this symbol was to claim a role as intermediaries between heaven and earth. But perhaps the most significant aspect of Merovingian rule was their relationship to the land itself. Unlike later feudal systems where kings ruled over territories through conquest or inheritance, the Merovingians seemed to embody a mystical connection to the earth they governed. Their authority wasn't imposed from without. It grew from within, from the sacred bond between the royal bloodline and the land itself. This connection manifested in various ways. Merovingian kings were often buried with elaborate grave goods that included not just weapons and jewelry, but objects that seemed to represent their role as guardians of the natural order. They were interred with symbols of fertility, growth, and renewal, suggesting that their sacred function extended beyond mere political rule to encompass the spiritual well-being of the realm itself. The administrative structure of Merovingian kingdoms reflected this unique understanding of royal authority, while they maintained the practical apparatus of government, taxes, armies, and courts. These institutions were suffused with ritual significance. Royal pronouncements weren't just legal documents. They were sacred utterances that carried spiritual as well as temporal weight. This is what made Dagobert's assassination so significant. It wasn't just the murder of a king. It was an attack on an entire system of sacred authority. The conspirators who gathered in the Ardennes forest that day weren't just plotting a political coup. They were attempting to sever a connection between heaven and earth that had endured for centuries. The forces behind Dagobert's death represented a new vision of how power should be organized in Christian Europe. They saw the Merovingian system of sacred kingship as an obstacle to the proper ordering of church and state. In their view, divine authority should flow through ecclesiastical channels, not through bloodlines that claimed direct connection to the sacred realm. But eliminating Dagobah was only the first step. The real challenge was erasing the entire Merovingian legacy, dismantling a system of belief that had sustained their rule for over 3 centuries. This required not just political maneuvering, but a careful campaign of historical revision that would transform sacred kings into footnotes and divine bloodlines into forgotten legends. The success of this campaign was so complete that for over 1,000 years the true significance of the Merovingians remained hidden. Their symbols were appropriated by later dynasties, their traditions absorbed into other systems, their very names relegated to obscure academic footnotes. But symbols have a way of surviving, even when their original meaning is forgotten. And bloodlines, if they truly exist, have a tendency to resurface when least expected. The story of the Merovingians didn't end in that forest in 679 AD. It went underground, carried forward by those who understood what had been lost, and were determined to preserve it for future generations. In our next episode, we'll explore how this preservation took place. We'll delve into the mysterious networks that kept the Merovingian secret alive through the Dark Ages. And we'll uncover the first clues that suggest their bloodline didn't die with Dagobert, but found new ways to survive and influence the course of European history. The rabbit hole goes deeper than you might imagine. And the players in this ancient drama are far more familiar than you might expect. From the corridors of medieval monasteries to the secret chambers of the world's most famous secret societies, the Merovingian legacy left traces that careful observers can still follow today. But before we follow that underground trail, we need to understand exactly what made the Merovingian claim so revolutionary and so dangerous that it required such extreme measures to suppress. The key lies in understanding what the Merovingians believed about themselves and, more importantly, what others believed about them. This wasn't just another royal dynasty making grandiose claims about divine favor. The Merovingians represented something that struck at the very heart of how medieval society understood the relationship between God, kingship, and earthly authority. Let's travel back to the early 6th century to the court of Clovis I, the Merovingian king whose conversion to Christianity would reshape the entire trajectory of European civilization. But this conversion came with a twist that most history books conveniently overlook. When Clovis knelt for baptism in the cathedral at Reims in 496 AD, the ceremony that took place was unlike any other royal baptism in Christian history. According to the chronicles, as the bishop prepared to anoint the king, a dove descended from the heavens carrying a vial of holy oil. This wasn't ordinary chrism blessed by human hands, but sacred oil delivered directly by divine intervention. The story might sound like religious propaganda, and indeed many modern historians dismiss it as such. But consider the implications of what the chroniclers were recording. They weren't just describing a political conversion or a diplomatic alliance between the Frankish kingdom and the Roman Church. They were documenting what they believed to be direct divine confirmation of the Merovingian bloodline's sacred nature. This divine oil, known as the Holy Ampulla, would become one of the most precious relics in medieval France. For over 1,000 years, every French king would be anointed with oil from this miraculous vial, connecting their authority directly back to that moment when heaven supposedly intervened to bless the Merovingian line. But here's where the story becomes truly intriguing. The Merovingians' understanding of their own Christianity was deeply influenced by traditions that predated their conversion. They didn't simply abandon their ancient beliefs when they embraced the new faith. They synthesized them, creating a unique form of Christian kingship that incorporated elements from much older sources. Archaeological evidence from Mevenian burial sites reveals a fascinating blend of Christian and pre-Christian symbolism. Golden bees, solar wheels, and serpent motifs appear alongside crosses and Christian inscriptions. These weren't random decorative choices. They represented a coherent symbolic system that expressed the Mir Ophians' understanding of their role as bridges between different realms of existence. The bee in particular deserves special attention. In ancient mystery traditions, bees were associated with the soul's journey between life and death, with wisdom that transcended mortal understanding, and with the divine feminine principle. When Napoleon Bonaparte discovered golden bees in the tomb of Chilry I, Clovis's father, he immediately recognized their significance and incorporated them into his own imperial symbolism. This wasn't mere antiquarian curiosity on Napoleon's part. He understood that symbols carry power across centuries, and by connecting himself to Mayan imagery, he was attempting to tap into something far older than the relatively recent Bourbon monarchy he had displaced. The Merovingians also maintained a complex relationship with prophecy and sacred time. Court chroniclers recorded numerous instances of Merovingian kings receiving prophetic dreams, experiencing visions, and demonstrating what could only be described as supernatural knowledge of future events. King Dagobert I, grandfather of the murdered Dagobert II, was said to have prophesied the exact circumstances of his own death years before it occurred. He described seeing himself in a dream, standing at the edge of a great forest, surrounded by figures in white, who warned him that his time was approaching its end. These weren't isolated incidents. Throughout Mevenian history, there are accounts of kings who seem to possess an uncanny ability to see beyond the veil of ordinary reality. They spoke of receiving guidance from sources that transcended normal human experience, and their subjects accepted these claims as natural expressions of their sacred bloodline. What made this particularly significant was how it differed from the Christian understanding of prophecy that was developing in the Church during the same period. Church doctrine held that prophetic gifts were bestowed by God on specific individuals for specific purposes, and that such gifts were temporary manifestations of divine grace, rather than inherited characteristics. The Merovingians, by contrast, seemed to view their prophetic abilities as inherent aspects of their bloodline passed down from generation to generation, like their long hair and their claim to sacred kingship. This created a theological problem that would only grow more acute as church doctrine became more systematized and centralized. The geographic extent of Merovingian influence also tells us something important about the nature of their authority. Their height. Merovingian kingdoms stretched from the Atlantic coast of France to the forests of Germany, from the Low Countries to the Mediterranean. This wasn't achieved through military conquest alone, though the Mevenians were certainly capable warriors. Instead, their expansion seems to have followed patterns that suggest a different kind of authority altogether. Communities would align themselves with Merovingian rule, not because they were conquered, but because they recognized something in the Mevenian bloodline that transcended ordinary political arrangements. This is evident in the way Mevenian kingdoms were organized. Unlike the rigid hierarchical structures that would characterize later feudal systems, Merovingian realms operated more like networks of sacred centers, each connected to the royal bloodline through bonds that were simultaneously political, spiritual, and mystical. Local nobles weren't just vassals. They were participants in a sacred order that derived its legitimacy from its connection to the divine kingship embodied in the Merovingian line. This created a form of governance that was remarkably stable and resilient, capable of surviving military defeats, economic disruptions, and even periods of weak or ineffective kings. The administrative documents that survive from Mevenian kingdoms reveal a system of law and governance that was deeply infused with sacred symbolism. Royal decrees weren't just political pronouncements. They were ritual acts that invoked the cosmic order and called upon divine sanction for earthly arrangements. Even the physical layout of Merovingian palaces and administrative centers reflected this integration of sacred and secular authority. Archaeological excavations have revealed that these structures were often built according to geometric patterns that incorporated both Christian symbolism and much older sacred geometry. The Great Hall at the Palace of Tori, for instance, was constructed with proportions that create specific acoustic effects during ceremonial gatherings. When the king spoke from his throne, his voice would resonate in ways that seemed to give his words supernatural power and authority. These weren't accidental features. The Merovingians understood that authority operates on multiple levels simultaneously, and they crafted their physical environment to reinforce the mystical dimensions of their rule. Every aspect of royal ceremony was designed to remind participants that they were in the presence of something that transcended ordinary human power. But perhaps the most significant aspect of Merovingian kingship was their relationship to the feminine divine. Unlike the increasingly patriarchal Christianity that was developing in Rome and Constantinople, Merovingian spirituality maintained a strong reverence for feminine sacred principles. This is evident in their devotion to the Black Madonna figures that appeared throughout their territories, in their patronage of female religious communities, and in the prominent roles that women played in Merovingian court life. Queens weren't just royal consorts. They were active participants in the sacred dimensions of kingship. Queen Bathilde, wife of Clovis II, was recognized as a saint by the Church, but her sanctity was understood by contemporaries as flowing from her participation in the sacred bloodline rather than from her individual piety. She was venerated not just for her personal virtues but for her role as a vessel of the divine feminine principle that was integral to Mayon's sacred kingship. This reverence for the feminine divine would become one of the most problematic aspects of Merovingian tradition from the perspective of church reformers. As Christianity became more institutionalized and hierarchical, there was less room for the kind of mystical synthesis that characterized Mayon's spirituality. The tension came to a head during the reign of Dagobert II. By the mid-17th century, church authorities had become increasingly uncomfortable with the Merovingian synthesis of Christian and pre-Christian elements. They saw it as a threat to the proper ordering of spiritual authority which they believed should flow through ecclesiastical channels rather than through bloodlines. At the same time, a new class of administrators had emerged in the Frankish kingdoms known as the mayors of the palace. These officials had gradually accumulated real political power, while the Merovingian kings retained ceremonial and spiritual authority. The most ambitious of these mayors began to envision a different kind of kingship altogether, one based on political effectiveness rather than sacred bloodline. The conspiracy that culminated in Dagobert's assassination represented the convergence of these various pressures. Church reformers, ambitious nobles, and pragmatic administrators all had reasons to want the Merovingian system replaced with something more conventional and controllable. But eliminating the kings was only the beginning. The real challenge was erasing the entire conceptual framework that had sustained Merovingian authority for centuries. This required a systematic campaign of historical revision that would transform sacred kings into ineffective relics and divine bloodlines into embarrassing anachronisms. The success of this campaign can be measured by how completely the Merovingian legacy disappeared from mainstream historical consciousness. Within a few generations, the dynasty that had shaped the spiritual and political landscape of early medieval Europe was reduced to a footnote in chronicles that emphasized their supposed weakness and irrelevance. But symbols have a way of surviving, even when their original meaning is suppressed. And certain individuals and groups understood exactly what had been lost when the Merovingian line was broken. They began the patient work of preservation, encoding the essential elements of the Merovingian legacy in forms that could survive the coming Dark Ages. This preservation effort would eventually give birth to some of the most mysterious and influential secret societies in European history. From the Knights Templar to the Priory of Sion, from the Rosicrucians to the Freemasons, these organizations would carry forward fragments of the Merovingian secret, waiting for the right moment to reveal what had been hidden. The trail they left behind is subtle but unmistakable, woven through the art, architecture, and literature of medieval and Renaissance Europe, hidden in plain sight, encrypted in stone and canvas. The Merovingian legacy continued to influence the course of Western civilization long after the last of their kings had fallen. In our next episode, we'll begin to follow this hidden trail. We'll explore how the Merovingian secret was preserved through the dangerous centuries that followed their fall. And we'll uncover the first clues that suggest their influence extended far beyond the political realm into the deepest mysteries of European esoteric tradition. The story is about to become much stranger, and the implications much more profound than anything we've encountered so far. But to understand how this preservation began, we need to venture into the shadows of 8th century Europe, where the first guardians of the Merovingian secret were already at work. In the monasteries scattered across the former Merovingian territories, a quiet revolution was taking place. Monks who had served the sacred kings were now faced with a choice: accept the new order or find ways to preserve what they believed to be a divine truth. Many chose preservation. In the scripturums of abbeys from Corbie to Sandon, scribes began the delicate work of encoding Merovingian law into seemingly innocent religious texts. Genealogies were disguised as saints' lives. Sacred symbols were incorporated into illuminated manuscripts. The true history of the divine bloodline was scattered across hundreds of documents, each containing fragments that would mean nothing to casual observers, but everything to those who knew how to read between the lines. This wasn't mere nostalgia for a fallen dynasty. These monks believed they were preserving something essential to the spiritual order of Europe. In their understanding, the Merovingian bloodline represented a direct connection to the divine that transcended political arrangements. The assassination of Dagobah hadn't just eliminated a king. It had severed a sacred link that had maintained the spiritual balance of Christendom. The new Carolingian dynasty, installed with papal blessing after the Merovingian fall, represented a fundamentally different understanding of kingship. Where the Merovingians had claimed authority through sacred blood, the Carolingians derived their legitimacy through church sanction and military might. It was effective, practical, and entirely conventional. But to the guardians of the old secret, it was also spiritually hollow. Charlemagne, the most famous of the Carolingian rulers, understood the power of symbols better than most. When he was crowned Holy Roman Emperor in 800 AD, he made sure to incorporate certain Merovingian elements into the ceremony. The golden bees that had once adorned Mayon regalia appeared on Carolingian coins and royal vestments. The sacred oil used for anointing still came from the same miraculous source that had blessed Clovis centuries earlier. This wasn't coincidence. Charlemagne recognized that legitimacy required more than papal approval and military success. It needed the weight of sacred tradition, the sense of connection to something greater than mere human ambition. By appropriating Mayon symbols while suppressing their true meaning, he attempted to have it both ways. But the guardians of the secret weren't fooled. They understood that symbols without their living context were empty vessels, impressive to look at, but devoid of real power. The true Merovingian legacy couldn't be captured in ceremonial regalia or architectural grandeur. It lived in the bloodline itself and in the knowledge of what that bloodline represented. This is where the story takes its first truly mysterious turn. Because according to the carefully preserved records of these monastic guardians, the Merovingian bloodline hadn't actually died with Dagobah. His son Sigebert had escaped the assassination and fled south to the longer region of France. There, protected by nobles who remained loyal to the old ways, he had lived in hiding, married, and continued the sacred line. The evidence for this survival is fragmentary and often contradictory. Exactly what you'd expect from a secret that needed to remain hidden for generations. But the consistency of certain details across multiple independent sources suggests that something real lay behind the legends. Names recur in unexpected places. Symbols appear where they shouldn't. Genealogies contain gaps that seem deliberately obscured. In the remote valleys of the Pyrenees, noble families began to appear in the historical record with heraldic devices that incorporated unmistakably Merovingian elements. The bee, the fleur de and more obscure symbols associated with the sacred bloodline showed up on coats of arms belonging to houses that claimed no direct connection to the fallen dynasty. These families seemed to operate according to different rules than their contemporaries. They maintained unusual independence from both church and royal authority. They patronized scholars and artists who worked with themes that echoed Mayan traditions, and they showed a particular devotion to sites and figures associated with what would later become known as the Holy Grail tradition. The Grail legends themselves deserve careful attention in this context. When these stories first began to appear in the literature of medieval Europe, they carried themes that seemed to echo the Merovingian understanding of sacred kingship. The wounded king whose realm suffers until he is healed. The quest for a sacred vessel that represents both spiritual achievement and dynastic legitimacy. The sense that something essential has been lost and must be recovered. But the most significant aspect of the early Grail romances was their geographic setting. These stories were almost invariably set in regions that had once been Merovingian strongholds. The courts described in the romances bore striking resemblances to what we know of Merovingian royal centers. And the knights who sought the Grail often displayed characteristics that echoed the sacred kingship traditions of the fallen dynasty. Crescendurtus, the 12th century poet who created some of the most influential Grail narratives, was patronized by noble houses in Champagne and Flanders that maintained curious connections to Merovingian law. His unfinished romance Percal contains elements that seem to encode genuine historical memories of the sacred bloodline tradition. The Grail itself in these early versions wasn't the cup of Christ's passion that it would later become in church-approved retellings. Instead, it was something more mysterious and more dangerous. A vessel that represented the continuation of a sacred bloodline. The preservation of divine authority through human generation, rather than institutional succession. This interpretation gains credibility when we examine the other elements that consistently appear in Grail narratives. The emphasis on bloodline and inheritance. The suggestion that the Grail's power is tied to specific families rather than individual virtue. The recurring theme of secrets that must be preserved against hostile forces. All of these elements align perfectly with what we know of Merovingian tradition and the circumstances of their fall. By the early 12th century, this underground preservation effort had begun to take more concrete form. Secret societies began to emerge, dedicated to protecting what they believed to be the most important secret in Christendom. These groups operated under various names and organizational structures, but they shared a common purpose to preserve the Merovingian bloodline and prepare for its eventual restoration. The most famous of these societies would become known to history as the Knights Templar. But their official mission of protecting pilgrims in the Holy Land may have been a cover for something far more significant. According to evidence that has emerged over the centuries, the Templars were actually guardians of the Merovingian secret, charged with protecting the descendants of the sacred bloodline until the time was right for their return. The timing of the Templars' formation is significant. They appeared in 1119, exactly 440 years after Dagobart's assassination. In the symbolic mathematics of medieval mysticism, this wasn't coincidence. It was a marker. A sign that the time of hiding was ending and the time of active preservation was beginning. The 9 founding Knights of the Temple spent their first decade in Jerusalem, conducting excavations beneath the Temple Mount. Officially, they were preparing quarters for their expanding order. But the scope and secrecy of their digging suggests they were searching for something specific. Historical documents from the period hint that they found what they were looking for. Not treasure in the conventional sense, but documents that confirm the survival of the Merovingian bloodline and its connection to the most sacred traditions of early Christianity. When the Templars returned to Europe, they brought with them more than just military experience and organizational skills. They carried knowledge that would reshape the spiritual landscape of medieval Christendom. Their churches incorporated architectural elements that had been absent from European sacred buildings for centuries. Their ritual practices echoed traditions that seemed to predate conventional Christianity, and their organizational structure reflected principles that bore striking resemblances to Merovingian sacred kingship. The Templar churches deserve particular attention. Unlike the conventional basilica form that dominated Christian architecture, Templar churches were often built as circular or octagonal structures that incorporated complex geometric relationships. These buildings weren't just functional spaces for worship. They were three-dimensional expressions of esoteric knowledge that related to the deepest mysteries of sacred tradition. The famous Temple Church in London with its circular nave and mysterious effigies of unknown knights represents this architectural philosophy at its most sophisticated. The proportions of the building encode mathematical relationships that were sacred to ancient mystery schools. The placement of columns and windows creates acoustic effects that enhance the ritual practices conducted within. Every element of the structure serves both practical and symbolic functions. But perhaps the most significant aspect of Templar architecture was its consistent incorporation of symbols associated with the feminine divine. Rose windows, labyrinth patterns, and architectural forms that echoed the sacred geometry of ancient goddess temples appeared throughout their buildings. This wasn't mere aesthetic choice. It reflected a theological understanding that differed significantly from the increasingly patriarchal orthodoxy of medieval Christianity. The Templars seemed to maintain a reverence for the feminine aspects of divinity that had been central to Mayan spirituality. Their churches included shrines to the Black Madonna, mysterious dark-skinned figures of the Virgin Mary that were said to possess miraculous powers. These images appeared with unusual frequency in regions that had once been Merovingian strongholds, and they were often associated with sites that had been sacred to pre-Christian goddess traditions. The connection between the Black Madonnas and the Merovingian secret becomes clearer when we examine the legends associated with these figures. Many were said to have been carved by Luke the Evangelist himself, giving them apostolic authority that bypassed normal church channels. Others were connected to miraculous appearances that occurred at sites significant to the sacred bloodline tradition. The Black Madonna of Louis, for instance, was said to have appeared to a woman suffering from fever who was instructed in a vision to climb a particular hill where she would find healing. When she reached the summit, she discovered not only the miraculous image, but also a dolmen, an ancient stone structure that predated Christianity by thousands of years. The church built a cathedral on the site, but the real significance lay in the continuity it represented between ancient sacred traditions and the Merovingian synthesis of Christian and pre-Christian elements. Similar patterns appear throughout Europe, wherever the Templars established a presence. Ancient sacred sites were incorporated into Christian foundations, but in ways that preserved and honored their original significance. Symbols from pre-Christian traditions were woven into Christian iconography, creating a visual language that could communicate on multiple levels simultaneously. This syncretic approach reflected the Templars' true mission to preserve and protect a tradition that transcended the conventional boundaries of Christian orthodoxy. They weren't heretics in the sense of rejecting Christian teaching. They were custodians of a more complete understanding of Christian truth that included elements the official church had chosen to suppress or ignore. The wealth and power that the Templars accumulated during their 2 centuries of operation served this deeper purpose. Their banking networks, their political influence, their military might, all of these were tools in service of their ultimate goal: protecting the sacred bloodline and preparing for its eventual emergence from hiding. But power attracts attention, and by the early 14th century, the Templars had become too visible to maintain their secret mission effectively. King Philip IV of France, deeply in debt to the order and suspicious of their independence, began to investigate their activities. What he discovered or thought he discovered led to one of the most dramatic persecutions in medieval history. On Friday, October 13, 1307, Templars throughout France were arrested simultaneously on charges of heresy, blasphemy, and devil worship. The specific accusations were bizarre and contradictory, ranging from worshipping a mysterious head called Baphomet to denying the divinity of Christ to engaging in obscene ritual practices. Most historians now agree that these charges were fabricated to justify the seizure of Templar wealth and the elimination of their political independence. But buried within the sensational accusations may have been fragments of genuine concerns about the order's true beliefs and practices. The worship of a mysterious head, for instance, might have been a distorted reference to their veneration of relics connected to the sacred bloodline under torture. Many Templars confessed to the charges against them, but their confessions were inconsistent and often contradictory. Some spoke of secret knowledge that had been passed down through the order's leadership. Others mentioned rituals that involved reverence for bloodline, rather than conventional Christian sacraments. A few even hinted at the existence of a sacred genealogy that had been preserved since ancient times. The suppression of the Templars marked the end of the first phase of organized protection for the Merovingian secret. But it wasn't the end of the secret itself. As the order faced destruction, its members scattered across Europe, carrying with them the knowledge they had preserved for 2 centuries. Some found refuge in other military orders that had remained loyal to the old traditions. Others melted into the general population, becoming merchants, scholars, or craftsmen who would pass their knowledge to the next generation through different channels. The most significant group of Templar refugees found their way to Scotland, where King Robert the Bruce had been excommunicated by the Pope, and therefore felt no obligation to enforce papal decrees against the order. There they established new foundations that would become crucial to the preservation of their secret mission. The famous Rosslyn Chapel, built by the Sinclair family in the 15th century, incorporates so many Templar and Merovingian symbols that it reads like a stone encyclopedia of the sacred bloodline tradition. But Scotland wasn't the only refuge for Templar knowledge. Throughout Europe, craft guilds and merchant associations began to incorporate elements of Templar organization and symbolism. The builders' guilds that would eventually become the Freemasons adopted geometric principles and ritual practices that bore striking resemblances to Templar traditions. The alchemical societies of the Renaissance period preserved chemical and spiritual knowledge that seemed to derive from Templar sources. These diverse groups maintained contact with each other through networks that operated below the level of official historical record. They communicated through symbols, through architectural forms, through artistic works that encoded their shared knowledge in forms that could survive persecution and suppression. The sacred bloodline tradition didn't disappear. It adapted, finding new forms of expression that could flourish in the changing conditions of late medieval and early modern Europe. By the Renaissance, this underground network had grown sophisticated enough to influence mainstream culture in subtle but significant ways. Artists, architects, and scholars who were connected to the tradition began to incorporate its symbols and themes into works that reached much broader audiences. The paintings of Leonardo da Vinci, the architecture of certain cathedrals, the literature of the Grail romances, all of these carried encoded references to the Merovingian secret for those who knew how to read them. The preservation had succeeded, but it had also transformed. What had begun as a political and dynastic secret had evolved into something more complex and far-reaching. The Merovingian bloodline, whether it survived in biological form or not, had become a symbol for alternative approaches to spiritual authority, for traditions that predated and transcended conventional religious institutions, for the preservation of ancient wisdom in forms that could survive the rise and fall of empires. This transformation would prove crucial to the secret's ultimate survival. By the time the modern world emerged from the medieval period, the Merovingian tradition had become embedded so deeply in European culture that it could never be entirely eliminated. It lived in symbols that appeared on public buildings, in stories that were told in village squares, in architectural principles that shaped the spaces where people gathered to worship and celebrate. The secret had become part of the cultural DNA of Western civilization, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right moment and the right circumstances to emerge from the shadows and reclaim its place in the light of history. That moment would come, but not for several more centuries. The guardians of the tradition would need to navigate the dangerous waters of the Reformation, the Enlightenment, and the modern age before their secret could safely be revealed. But they had learned patience over the long centuries of hiding, and they understood that some truths are worth waiting for, no matter how long the wait might be. The Renaissance brought with it more than just artistic rebirth and scientific discovery. Hidden beneath the surface of this cultural flowering, the guardians of the Mayans' secret found new opportunities to encode their ancient knowledge into forms that could reach the highest levels of European society. Artists, architects, and scholars connected to the tradition began to weave their symbols and themes into works that would endure for centuries, creating a visual language that spoke to initiates while remaining invisible to the uninformed. Leonardo da Vinci stands as perhaps the most intriguing figure in this Renaissance preservation effort. His notebooks contain geometric diagrams that echo the sacred mathematics found in Templar architecture. His anatomical studies incorporate symbols that appear nowhere in conventional medical texts of the period. And his paintings, particularly those depicting religious scenes, contain anomalies that have puzzled art historians for centuries. Consider the famous Last Supper fresco in Milan. Traditional interpretation identifies the figure seated to Christ's right as the Apostle John. But the feminine features, the flowing auburn hair, and the distinctive positioning suggest something else entirely. The V-shaped space between this figure and Christ creates a form that resembles a chalice. But not the kind you drink from. This is the Grail as vessel, as continuation, as the sacred feminine principle that ensures the perpetuation of the divine bloodline. Leonardo's Virgin of the Rocks presents even more intriguing mysteries. Two versions of this painting exist, housed in different museums, but both incorporate elements that seem to reference traditions outside mainstream Christianity. The rocky cave setting evokes the sacred grotto associated with goddess worship in pre-Christian times. The positioning of the figures creates triangular relationships that echo the geometric principles preserved in Templar and Masonic traditions. But perhaps most significantly, both versions contain subtle anatomical details that suggest knowledge of embryonic development that wouldn't be scientifically documented for centuries. Hidden within the drapery and landscape forms are shapes that unmistakably represent the stages of human gestation. For those who understood the true meaning of the Grail as sacred bloodline, these details would have served as confirmation that Leonardo was indeed an initiate of the tradition. The architectural projects of the Renaissance period provide even clearer evidence of the secret tradition's influence. Filippo Brunelleschi's dome for the Florence Cathedral incorporates proportional relationships that had been absent from Christian architecture since the fall of the Merovingians. The spiral staircases in chateaux throughout the Lier Valley follow patterns that echo the sacred geometry preserved in Templar manuscripts. Even the layout of Renaissance gardens reflected principles that connected the earthly realm to celestial harmonies in ways that recalled Merovingian understanding of sacred kingship. These weren't coincidental developments. Behind the scenes, a network of patrons, scholars, and craftsmen was working to reintroduce ancient wisdom into European culture through forms that would be acceptable to church and secular authorities. Noble families in France, Italy, and the Low Countries maintained libraries that contained manuscripts predating the Carolean period. Merchant guilds incorporated symbolic elements into their ceremonial practices that preserved fragments of older traditions. The Medusche family of Florence exemplifies this phenomenon. Their patronage of artists and scholars wasn't merely an expression of wealth and taste. It served a deeper purpose of preserving and transmitting knowledge that connected Renaissance humanism to much older streams of wisdom. The Platonic Academy they sponsored in Florence became a center for the study of ancient mysteries that had been suppressed by conventional Christianity for centuries. Macilio Ficino, the Academy's leading philosopher, translated texts from Greek, Arabic, and Latin sources that hadn't been available in Western Europe since before the Merovingian period. His work on Hermetic philosophy, Neoplatonism, and the writings attributed to Dionysius, the Areopagite, reintroduced concepts that had been central to the sacred kingship traditions of the early medieval period. But these scholarly efforts represented only the visible tip of a much larger preservation project. In workshops throughout Europe, craftsmen were learning techniques that had been passed down through guild traditions stretching back to the Templar period. Master masons incorporated sacred geometry into cathedral construction projects that would take generations to complete. Goldsmiths and jewelers created pieces that encoded symbolic messages in forms that could be worn at court without attracting unwanted attention. The printing press, invented in the mid-15th century, created new opportunities for the preservation and dissemination of hidden knowledge. Books could now be produced in multiple copies and distributed across wide geographic areas, making it much more difficult for authorities to suppress dangerous ideas through the destruction of single manuscripts. Alchemical texts proliferated during this period, ostensibly dealing with the transformation of base metals into gold, but actually encoding spiritual and genealogical knowledge that related to the transformation of ordinary humanity into something sacred and divine. The language of chemical processes provided a perfect cipher for discussing the preservation and cultivation of sacred bloodlines. The Rosicrucian manifestos that appeared in early 17th century Germany represent a culmination of this Renaissance preservation effort. These mysterious documents attributed to a legendary figure known as Christian Rosenkreuz announced the existence of a secret brotherhood dedicated to the reformation of human knowledge and the restoration of ancient wisdom. The Rosicrucian writings incorporated elements from all the major streams of the hidden tradition. Templar symbolism appeared alongside alchemical imagery. References to sacred geometry were combined with genealogical allegories. The overall message was clear. The time of hiding was ending and the ancient secrets were ready to emerge into the light of a new age. But the Rosicrucians were careful to present their revelations in forms that could be dismissed as fantasy by those who weren't ready to receive them. The story of Christian Rosenkreuz himself was obviously allegorical, combining elements from various historical figures associated with the preservation tradition. The promised Reformation was described in language that could be interpreted as either spiritual metaphor or practical program. This careful ambiguity reflected lessons learned from the persecution of the Templars 3 centuries earlier. The guardians of the secret had discovered that direct revelation was dangerous, but symbolic communication could survive and flourish even under hostile conditions. By encoding their knowledge in forms that operated on multiple levels of meaning simultaneously, they could reach initiates while remaining invisible to persecutors. The success of this strategy becomes apparent when we examine the spread of Masonic lodges throughout Europe during the 17th and 18th centuries. Officially, these were associations of working stonemasons who gathered to share trade secrets and provide mutual support. In practice, they became repositories for symbolic knowledge that connected back to the Templar period and beyond. Masonic ritual incorporated elements that would have been immediately recognizable to anyone familiar with Meovinian traditions. The emphasis on bloodline and inheritance, the reverence for sacred geometry, the use of architectural symbolism to represent spiritual truths. All of these reflected the continuing influence of the ancient secret. The Masonic legend of Hiram Abath, the master builder of Solomon's temple, who was murdered for refusing to reveal the secrets of his craft, clearly echoed the story of Dagobah's assassination and the suppression of the sacred bloodline. The promise of the master's eventual return and the restoration of the lost knowledge directly paralleled the Meovinian hope for dynastic restoration. Even the physical layout of Masonic lodges reflected principles that had been preserved from the Merovingian period. The east-west orientation, the placement of pillars and altars, the use of specific proportional relationships. All of these created spaces that functioned as three-dimensional expressions of the secret tradition's understanding of sacred architecture. The spread of Masonry coincided with the emergence of Enlightenment philosophy. And this wasn't coincidental. Many of the intellectual movements that challenged traditional religious and political authority drew inspiration from sources that connected back to the hidden tradition. The emphasis on reason over revelation, the questioning of inherited hierarchies, the search for natural law underlying human institutions. All of these reflected principles that had been preserved in secret for centuries. Voltaire's attacks on organized religion, Rousseau's theories about natural human goodness, Darrow's encyclopedic project to catalog all human knowledge. These Enlightenment projects serve the hidden tradition's goal of undermining the institutional structures that had suppressed the ancient secrets. By promoting individual reason and questioning established authority, Enlightenment thinkers created intellectual space for alternative understandings of history and tradition. The American Revolution represents the most dramatic example of how the preserved tradition influenced world events. Many of the founding fathers were Masons who had been exposed to symbolic teachings that connected back to the Merovingian secret. The principles they embedded in the Declaration of Independence and Constitution reflected ideas about natural law and sacred inheritance that had been preserved in hidden form for over 1,000 years. The layout of Washington, D.C. provides clear evidence of this influence. The city street plan incorporates geometric relationships that echo the sacred architecture of Templar churches and Merovingian palaces. The positioning of major monuments creates sightlines that connect to celestial events in ways that recall ancient understanding of the relationship between earthly and heavenly authority. The Great Seal of the United States contains symbols that would have been immediately recognizable to anyone familiar with the preserved tradition. The all-seeing eye, the unfinished pyramid, the eagle with spread wings. All of these connect to symbolic systems that had been maintained in secret since the medieval period. But perhaps the most significant aspect of the American experiment was its establishment of a form of government that embodied principles the hidden tradition had been working to restore for centuries. The idea that authority derives from natural law, rather than inherited bloodline or institutional sanction, represented a revolutionary application of concepts that had been preserved in Masonic and Rosicrucian teachings. The French Revolution that followed the American example carried these principles even further, but also revealed the dangers inherent in rapid social transformation. The violence and chaos that accompanied the overthrow of the old regime in France demonstrated that the ancient secrets couldn't simply be revealed directly without careful preparation and gradual implementation. Napoleon's rise to power during this period represents another fascinating intersection between the preserved tradition and world events. His adoption of Merovingian symbols, particularly the golden bee, wasn't merely aesthetic choice, but reflected his understanding of the symbolic language that had been maintained in secret for centuries. The Code Napoleon, which established legal principles that spread throughout Europe and beyond, incorporated concepts of natural law and individual rights that echoed teachings preserved in the hidden tradition. The metric system introduced during Napoleon's reign reflected mathematical principles that connected to the sacred geometry, maintained in Masonic and Rosicrucian circles. Even Napoleon's military campaigns can be understood as attempts to restore European unity under principles that recalled the Merovingian understanding of sacred kingship. His coronation ceremony deliberately evoked Carolingian precedents, but with symbolic elements that connected back to older traditions that had been suppressed for over a millennium. The Congress of Vienna that followed Napoleon's defeat represented an attempt by traditional European powers to restore the old order. But the ideas unleashed by the American and French revolutions couldn't be contained. Throughout the 19th century, revolutionary movements across Europe drew inspiration from concepts that had been preserved in the hidden tradition. The 1848 revolutions that swept across Europe were organized largely through networks that connected back to Masonic and related secret societies. The unification movements in Germany and Italy were led by figures who had been exposed to symbolic teachings about natural law and sacred inheritance. Even the labor movements that emerged during the Industrial Revolution incorporated organizational principles that reflected the influence of the preserved tradition. By the mid-19th century, the guardians of the secret faced a new challenge. The ancient knowledge they had preserved for over 1,000 years was beginning to emerge into public consciousness through multiple channels simultaneously. Academic scholars were rediscovering medieval manuscripts that contained fragments of the suppressed history. Archaeological discoveries were revealing evidence of pre-Christian traditions that had influenced early European civilization. Popular interest in ancient mysteries was creating demand for information that had previously been restricted to initiates. This emergence created both opportunities and dangers. On one hand, the changing intellectual climate made it possible to discuss ideas that would have been dangerously heretical in earlier periods. On the other hand, Partial revelation carried the risk of distortion and misunderstanding that could corrupt the tradition's essential teachings. The solution adopted by the tradition's guardians was characteristically subtle. Rather than attempting to control the emerging information, they began to guide it, ensuring that genuine revelation was accompanied by the context necessary for proper understanding. Scholarly societies were established to study medieval history and archaeology. Publishing ventures were launched to make important texts available to qualified researchers. Educational institutions were founded to train individuals in the analytical skills necessary to interpret complex symbolic systems. This guidance effort required unprecedented coordination among groups that had operated independently for centuries. Masonic lodges, Rosicrucian circles, academic institutions, and publishing houses all needed to work together, while maintaining their distinct identities and purposes. The network that emerged from this coordination would prove capable of influencing cultural and intellectual developments on a global scale. The Victorian era's fascination with ancient mysteries, medieval romanticism, and archaeological discovery provided perfect cover for this guided revelation project. Popular novels about Arthurian legends introduced millions of readers to themes connected to the Grail tradition. Archaeological expeditions uncovered evidence of pre-Christian civilizations that had influenced early European development. Academic conferences brought together scholars from different disciplines to share research that gradually assembled a more complete picture of suppressed historical traditions. But even as the ancient secrets began to emerge into public consciousness, their most essential elements remained carefully protected. The actual survival of the Merovingian bloodline. The specific locations where crucial documents were preserved. The identities of families and organizations that maintained the tradition. All of these continued to be guarded with the same care that had protected them for over a millennium. The 20th century would bring challenges that would test this protective system in ways that previous generations could never have imagined. 2 world wars, revolutionary political movements, and technological developments that made global communication instantaneous would all impact the careful balance between revelation and concealment that the tradition's guardians had maintained for so long. But by then, the ancient secret had become so deeply embedded in Western culture that it could survive even the most dramatic upheavals. The symbols were carved in stone on public buildings. The ideas were encoded in legal and political systems. The knowledge was preserved in libraries and museums around the world. The bloodline, whether biological or symbolic, had become part of the cultural DNA of modern civilization. The stage was set for the final phase of a preservation project that had lasted over 13 centuries. The time was approaching when the secret could finally be revealed in its complete form. When the hidden history could emerge from the shadows and take its place in the light of historical understanding. But that revelation would come with its own challenges and dangers, as the guardians of the tradition were about to discover. The industrial age brought with it new forms of power that the ancient guardians had never encountered before. Steam engines thundered across landscapes that had once known only the gentle rhythm of horse hooves. Telegraph lines carried messages faster than any medieval courier could have imagined. And in the great cities that sprouted like iron flowers across Europe and America, millions of people gathered in concentrations that dwarfed the largest medieval courts. For the preservers of the Merovingian secret, these changes represented both unprecedented opportunity and mortal danger. The same technologies that could spread their carefully guarded knowledge to audiences beyond their wildest dreams could also expose their networks to scrutiny from hostile forces. Equipped with investigative capabilities that no previous generation had possessed, the response was characteristically subtle and sophisticated. Rather than resist the new technologies, the tradition's guardians embraced them, but on their own terms. Newspapers owned by families connected to the preservation network began publishing articles about medieval history that contained carefully encoded references to the suppressed traditions. Railway companies incorporated Masonic symbols into their corporate emblems, creating a visual language that could communicate across vast distances to those who knew how to read it. The great museums that arose during this period, served a particularly important function in the preservation strategy. Artifacts that had been hidden in private collections for centuries could now be displayed publicly, but in contexts that obscured their true significance to casual observers, while making them available for study by serious researchers. The British Museum, the Louvre, the Smithsonian, all became repositories for objects that told the story of the hidden tradition to those who possessed the knowledge necessary to interpret them correctly. Banking families played a crucial role in this 19th century phase of the preservation effort. The Rothschilds, the Morgans, the Warburgs. These financial dynasties possessed the resources necessary to fund large-scale projects that could influence cultural and intellectual development across multiple countries simultaneously. Their patronage of archaeological expeditions, scholarly research, and artistic endeavors created a network of influence that operated largely below the level of public awareness. The expansion of higher education during this period provided another avenue for the guided revelation of ancient secrets. Universities that had been founded centuries earlier by groups connected to the preservation tradition began to establish new departments dedicated to the study of medieval history, comparative religion, and ancient languages. These academic programs trained generations of scholars who gradually assembled a more complete picture of European history that included elements the Church had suppressed for over a millennium. But perhaps the most significant development of the Industrial Age was the emergence of a global communication network that made coordination between preservation groups on different continents not just possible but routine. Masonic lodges in London could now maintain regular contact with their counterparts in New York, Paris, and Vienna. Rosicrucian circles could share research and coordinate activities across national boundaries that had previously seemed insurmountable. This global coordination became essential as the Industrial Age progressed, and the ancient secrets began to attract attention from forces that posed new kinds of threats to the preservation tradition. Nationalist movements across Europe began appropriating symbols and themes from medieval history for their own political purposes, often distorting their original meanings in ways that threatened to corrupt the authentic tradition. The most dangerous of these appropriations occurred in Germany during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Scholars connected to the emerging Pan-Germanic movement began studying medieval German history, with particular attention to the pre-Christian traditions that had influenced early European civilization. Their research uncovered genuine fragments of the suppressed knowledge, but they interpreted these discoveries through the lens of racial ideology that transformed sacred universal principles into tools of ethnic supremacy. The rise of archaeological nationalism during this period created additional complications for the preservation tradition. Governments began claiming ownership of ancient artifacts discovered within their borders, making it much more difficult for the guardians to control how sensitive materials were studied and interpreted. The discovery of major archaeological sites often became occasions for nationalist celebration that obscured the universal significance of what had been found. World War I represented a watershed moment for the preservation tradition. The conflict destroyed many of the institutional structures that had maintained the ancient secrets for centuries. Monasteries were abandoned, libraries were burned, and entire noble families that had carried the tradition for generations were wiped out in the carnage. The careful balance between revelation and concealment that had been maintained for over a millennium was shattered by the unprecedented scale of destruction. But the guardians of the tradition had learned resilience over the long centuries of hiding. As the old structures crumbled, new ones emerged to take their place. Veterans organizations, professional associations, and cultural societies became vehicles for preserving connections between individuals who shared knowledge of the ancient secrets. The tradition adapted once again, finding new forms of expression that could survive in the changed conditions of the modern world. The interwar period saw an explosion of popular interest in ancient mysteries and esoteric traditions. Books about Atlantis, the Holy Grail, and lost civilizations became bestsellers. Archaeological discoveries in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and elsewhere captured public imagination in ways that created unprecedented opportunities for the guided revelation of suppressed knowledge. But this popular interest also attracted charlatans and opportunists who distorted authentic traditions for their own purposes. The Guardians found themselves in the difficult position of trying to guide genuine revelation, while simultaneously combating misinformation and deliberate deception. Secret societies proliferated during this period, many claiming connections to ancient traditions that they didn't actually possess. The rise of totalitarian movements in Germany, Italy, and the Soviet Union created new dangers for the preservation tradition. These regimes possessed investigative capabilities that exceeded anything in previous history, and they were actively hostile to the kind of international networks that the Guardians had built over centuries. The Nazi regime, in particular, launched systematic efforts to appropriate symbols and traditions connected to the ancient Germanic past, often distorting their meanings in ways that served ideological purposes, completely opposed to the universal principles they originally represented. Some groups connected to the preservation tradition attempted to work with these new regimes, believing they could guide them toward a more authentic understanding of the ancient traditions. These efforts proved disastrously naive. The totalitarian movements were interested only in symbols and narratives that could serve their political purposes, not in the genuine wisdom that the preservation tradition had maintained for over a millennium. The Second World War brought destruction on a scale that made the previous conflict seem limited by comparison. Entire cities were reduced to rubble. Libraries that had preserved ancient manuscripts for centuries were destroyed in bombing raids, and networks that had maintained connections across Europe for generations were scattered to the winds. But once again, the tradition's guardians demonstrated their remarkable adaptability. As Europe burned around them, they found ways to preserve their most essential knowledge and maintain connections that would allow for reconstruction once the conflict ended. Documents were microfilmed and hidden in multiple locations. Key individuals were evacuated to safe havens in neutral countries. Plans were made for rebuilding the preservation network once peace returned. The post-war period brought challenges that were in some ways more difficult than the destruction of the war itself. The emergence of the United States and Soviet Union as global superpowers created a bipolar world in which the kind of international networks the preservation tradition required became objects of suspicion from intelligence agencies on both sides of the Iron Curtain. The development of electronic surveillance capabilities by government agencies posed particular problems for groups that had always relied on secrecy for their survival. Communication methods that had been secure for centuries became vulnerable to interception and decoding by intelligence services equipped with unprecedented technological capabilities. But the post-war period also brought new opportunities. The establishment of international organizations like the United Nations, NATO, and the European Economic Community created legitimate frameworks for the kind of international cooperation the preservation tradition required. Academic exchanges, cultural programs, and scientific collaborations provided cover for activities that would have been impossible during the age of absolute monarchies. The explosion of higher education that occurred in the decades following the war created vast new audiences for the kind of scholarly research that could reveal ancient secrets in academically acceptable forms. University programs in medieval studies, comparative religion, and archaeology trained thousands of researchers who gradually assembled a more complete picture of European history that included many elements the Church had suppressed for over a millennium. The development of mass media during this period provided unprecedented opportunities for reaching general audiences with information that had previously been restricted to small circles of initiates. Television documentaries, popular magazines, and paperback books could introduce millions of people to ideas and symbols that connected to the ancient tradition, even if the full context wasn't always provided. By the 1960s, the cultural climate had changed dramatically from what it had been even a generation earlier. The authority of traditional religious institutions was being questioned by broad segments of the population. Interest in alternative spirituality and ancient wisdom traditions was exploding. Archaeological discoveries were revealing evidence of sophisticated civilizations that predated the rise of Christianity by thousands of years. These developments created the most favorable conditions for revelation that the preservation tradition had encountered since the fall of the Merovingians over a millennium earlier. For the first time in centuries, it became possible to discuss ideas that would have been dangerously heretical in previous periods without facing persecution or suppression. The guardians of the tradition faced a momentous decision. Should they continue the careful policy of gradual revelation that had served them for over 1,000 years? Or was it finally time to reveal the complete truth about the Merovingian bloodline and its survival through the centuries? The decision they made would reshape the cultural landscape of the late 20th century and create reverberations that continue to influence our understanding of history, religion, and the nature of sacred authority to this day. In 1967, a mysterious document appeared in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, filed under the innocuous title Dossier Secrets. It contained genealogical charts, historical references, and lists of grand masters that claimed to trace the survival of the Merovingian bloodline through an organization called the Priory of Sion. The document appeared to be the work of amateur historians, and most professional scholars dismissed it as fantasy or deliberate fraud. But buried within the obviously fabricated elements were details too precise and obscure to dismiss entirely. Ancient family trees that matched genuine historical records, references to real documents that could be verified in archives across Europe, symbols and heraldic devices that connected to authentic medieval traditions. The dossier's secrets represented a new phase in the preservation tradition's revelation strategy. Rather than continuing the slow process of academic disclosure that had characterized previous centuries, the guardians had decided to release a significant portion of their knowledge in a form that could be dismissed as fiction by those who weren't ready to receive it, while providing genuine researchers with clues that could lead to much deeper discoveries. The strategy proved remarkably effective. The documents attracted the attention of serious researchers who began following the trails they provided, leading to genuine discoveries about suppressed aspects of European history. At the same time, the obviously questionable elements of the dossier allowed skeptics to dismiss the entire phenomenon as elaborate hoax, protecting the tradition from unwanted attention from hostile forces. The publication of Holy Blood, Holy Grail in 1982, marked another milestone in this revelation process. The book presented the theory that Jesus had married Mary Magdalene, that their descendants had founded the Merovingian dynasty, and that this bloodline had survived to the present day under the protection of secret societies like the Priory of Sion and the Knights Templar. The book became an international bestseller, introducing millions of readers to ideas that had been preserved in secret for over a millennium. But it also generated fierce controversy, with church authorities and academic historians united in their condemnation of what they saw as sensationalist speculation based on questionable evidence. The success of Holy Blood, Holy Grail, and similar works created a new cultural phenomenon, the alternative history movement. Dozens of books appeared claiming to reveal suppressed truths about ancient civilizations, secret societies, and hidden bloodlines. Television documentaries explored mysterious archaeological sites and unexplained historical phenomena. The Internet provided platforms for researchers who challenged orthodox interpretations of the past. This explosion of alternative historical research created both opportunities and problems for the preservation tradition. On one hand, it provided cover for the revelation of genuine suppressed knowledge. On the other hand, it attracted numerous fraudsters and fantasists whose distortions threatened to discredit authentic discoveries. The guardians found themselves in the position of trying to guide genuine revelation, while simultaneously combating misinformation and deliberate deception. They developed sophisticated strategies for distinguishing between authentic researchers and opportunistic charlatans, providing assistance to the former while working to neutralize the latter. The development of computer technology and the Internet during the final decades of the 20th century created unprecedented opportunities for both revelation and research. Ancient manuscripts could be digitized and made available to researchers around the world. Archaeological discoveries could be documented and shared instantly. Networks of researchers could collaborate on projects that would have taken decades to complete using traditional methods. But these same technologies also created new vulnerabilities. Government surveillance capabilities expanded exponentially, making it much more difficult to maintain the kind of secrecy that had protected the tradition for centuries. The democratization of information that the Internet represented meant that sensitive knowledge could be accessed by anyone with a computer and an Internet connection. The Guardians adapted by developing new forms of concealment that took advantage of the very openness of the digital age. Information could be hidden in plain sight by embedding it in vast databases where it would be invisible to casual browsers but accessible to researchers who knew what they were looking for. Encrypted communication systems allowed for secure coordination between preservation groups around the world. By the beginning of the 21st century, the ancient secret that had been preserved for over 1,300 years was finally ready for complete revelation. The cultural, technological, and intellectual conditions necessary for understanding and accepting the truth about the Merovingian bloodline and its significance had finally been achieved. The stage was set for the most dramatic revelation in the history of Western civilization. The hidden dynasty that had shaped European development for over 3 centuries was about to emerge from the shadows and reclaim its place in the light of historical understanding. But even as this final revelation approached, questions remained that would challenge everything we thought we knew about history, religion, and the nature of sacred authority itself. Was the Merovingian bloodline a biological reality that had survived through careful preservation? Or had it evolved into something more symbolic but equally powerful? Did the secret societies that claimed to protect it actually possess the knowledge they claimed? Or had they become guardians of empty rituals whose original meaning had been lost? Most importantly, what would it mean for our understanding of Christianity, European history, and the foundations of Western civilization if the claims about the Merovingian bloodline proved to be true? The implications were staggering, and the guardians of the tradition knew that revealing the complete truth would transform not just historical scholarship, but the fundamental assumptions on which modern society was built. The time had come to find out whether the world was finally ready for the most carefully guarded secret in human history. The dawn of the 21st century brought with it technologies that would have seemed like magic to the medieval guardians who first began preserving the Merovingian secret. Digital archives could store the contents of entire libraries in devices smaller than a single manuscript. Satellite communications allowed instant contact between researchers on opposite sides of the globe. Most importantly, the Internet created a vast interconnected web of information that operated beyond the control of any single government or institution. For the preservers of the ancient bloodline secret, these developments represented the culmination of everything they had worked toward for over 13 centuries. The tools finally existed to reveal their carefully guarded knowledge to a global audience, while maintaining the security and verification systems necessary to distinguish authentic information from the flood of speculation and misinformation that had always surrounded their work. The first phase of this digital revelation began quietly, almost invisibly. Academic databases started, including previously classified documents from Vatican archives, archaeological survey data that had been restricted for decades, suddenly became available to qualified researchers. Genealogical records that had been held in private family collections for centuries were digitized and made accessible through specialized research platforms. To casual observers, these releases looked like routine academic housekeeping, the natural result of institutions modernizing their record-keeping systems. But to those who knew what to look for, they represented a coordinated effort to make available the documentary evidence necessary to support the most extraordinary claims in European history. Dr. Catherine Montlaire, a medieval historian at the Seine, was among the first to recognize the pattern. Her research into early Frankish genealogies had been hampered for years by gaps in the available records, particularly regarding the period immediately following Dagobart's assassination. Suddenly, in the space of just a few months, documents began appearing in digital archives that filled many of those gaps. Marriage records from 8th century monasteries, land grants that mention noble families with suspiciously Merovingian-sounding names, correspondence between bishops that hinted at ongoing concerns about irregular bloodlines decades after the official end of the dynasty. Each document by itself might have been dismissed as a historical curiosity, but together they painted a picture of systematic concealment that had persisted long after the Carolingians claimed to have eliminated their predecessors. Dr. Montlair's breakthrough came when she applied pattern recognition software to the accumulated data. The algorithms identified connections that would have taken human researchers years to discover manually. Names that appeared in different regions at roughly the same times. Family symbols that evolved gradually from recognizably Merovingian motifs into forms that could pass unnoticed in later centuries. Migration patterns that suggested coordinated movement of related family groups, away from areas of political instability. The picture that emerged was stunning in its implications. The Merovingian bloodline hadn't been eliminated in 679 AD. Instead, it had been dispersed, scattered across Europe in a deliberate strategy designed to ensure its survival through the dangerous centuries that followed. Different branches of the family had adopted different names, integrated into local nobility, and maintained their connections through networks that operated below the level of official historical record. But Dr. Montlair's research represented only one thread in a much larger tapestry of revelation that was beginning to unfold across multiple disciplines simultaneously. In England, architectural historians were discovering that certain medieval buildings incorporated geometric principles that had supposedly been lost with the fall of classical civilization. In Italy, art restoration projects were uncovering hidden layers in Renaissance paintings that contained symbols and imagery connecting to much older traditions. The most dramatic discoveries were emerging from archaeological sites across France, particularly in regions that had been Merovingian strongholds. Ground-penetrating radar was revealing buried structures beneath ancient churches and monasteries. When excavated, these sites yielded artifacts that challenged conventional understanding of early medieval European culture. The excavations at Saint-Denis, the traditional burial place of French kings, proved particularly significant. Beneath the known royal tombs, archaeologists discovered earlier burial chambers that had been deliberately sealed and forgotten. The grave goods found in these chambers included objects that bore unmistakably Merovingian symbols, but crafted with techniques that were supposedly developed centuries later. Carbon dating of organic materials from these tombs consistently returned dates from the 8th and 9th centuries, precisely the period when the Merovingian bloodline was supposed to have been extinct. But the sophistication of the metal work, the complexity of the symbolic systems, and the evident wealth of the burials all suggested that whoever had been interred in these chambers possessed resources and knowledge that far exceeded what conventional history attributed to the post-Merovingian period. The implications were staggering. If these burials represented Merovingian descendants who had survived the official extinction of their dynasty, then everything historians thought they knew about the transition from the early to high medieval period would need to be reconsidered. But archaeological evidence was only part of a much larger revelation that was emerging from multiple sources simultaneously. Genetic research using DNA samples from authenticated Merovingian remains was beginning to trace biological connections that extended far beyond the traditionally accepted end of the dynasty. Dr. James Sinclair, a geneticist at Edinburgh University, whose own family name connected to the Scottish preservers of Templar traditions, had been quietly building a database of genetic markers found in remains from confirmed Merovingian burial sites. When he began comparing these markers to DNA samples from living members of European noble families, the results defied explanation. Genetic signatures that matched Mayon patterns appeared in family lines across France, Spain, England, and Scotland. The distribution wasn't random. It followed patterns that suggested deliberate preservation and cultivation over many generations. Most remarkably, some of the strongest genetic connections appeared in families that had no documented historical connection to the Merovingian dynasty, but whose genealogies contained the kinds of gaps and inconsistencies that might indicate deliberate concealment. The Sinclair family's own genetic profile proved particularly intriguing. Dr. Sinclair's DNA contained markers that appeared nowhere else in the Scottish population, but matched samples from Meavravinian burial sites with remarkable precision. When he extended his research to other members of families associated with Rosslyn Chapel and the Scottish Templar refugees, similar patterns emerged consistently. These genetic discoveries were being paralleled by breakthroughs in other fields that painted an increasingly coherent picture of systematic historical concealment. Linguistic analysis of medieval texts was revealing coded messages that had remained hidden for centuries. Astronomical calculations were showing that certain architectural alignments in Templar and Masonic buildings corresponded to celestial events that had special significance in Meavinian royal traditions. Perhaps most significantly, advances in cryptography were finally allowing researchers to decode documents that had been considered indecipherable for generations. The famous Shepherd's document from Near Al, long dismissed as meaningless scribal practice, proved to contain a sophisticated cipher that revealed genealogical information, connecting prominent Renaissance families to much older bloodlines. As these various threads of research began to converge, a new understanding of European history started to emerge that was radically different from orthodox academic interpretations. The medieval period hadn't been a simple progression from primitive Germanic kingdoms to sophisticated feudal hierarchies. Instead, it had been characterized by a hidden struggle between two fundamentally different conceptions of authority and legitimacy. On one side stood the institutional approach represented by the Carolingian Papal Alliance, which held that legitimate authority flowed through established channels of succession, whether royal or ecclesiastical. On the other stood the bloodline tradition embodied by the Merovinians and their secret protectors, which maintained that certain forms of authority were inherent in specific family lines and couldn't be transferred or eliminated through political maneuvering. This struggle had continued for over a millennium, sometimes breaking into open conflict, more often playing out through subtle influences on cultural and intellectual development. The preservation networks that protected the Meavinian secret had simultaneously worked to undermine the monopolistic claims of church and state authority, promoting ideas about natural law, individual rights, and limited government that would eventually reshape Western civilization. The American Revolution, the French Revolution, the development of constitutional democracy, even the modern concept of human rights, all could be traced back to principles that had been preserved and transmitted by the guardians of the ancient bloodline tradition. The secret societies that protected the Meavinian legacy hadn't just been passive preservers of historical curiosities. They had been active agents in the transformation of European and world civilization. But as this new understanding of history emerged from academic obscurity into public consciousness, it triggered reactions that demonstrated just how threatening these revelations remained to established institutions. The Vatican issued carefully worded statements emphasizing the importance of distinguishing between documented historical facts and speculative theories. Academic conferences on medieval history began excluding papers that dealt with certain sensitive topics. Publishing houses found themselves under pressure to avoid books that challenged orthodox interpretations of early European development. The resistance wasn't limited to religious and academic institutions. Government agencies in several countries began monitoring researchers whose work touched on the Merovinian question. Private investigators appeared at archaeological sites where significant discoveries were being made. Funding for certain research projects was mysteriously withdrawn without explanation. These reactions only served to confirm that the emerging revelations touched on issues that went far beyond academic historical debate. The survival of the Merovinian bloodline, proven, would challenge not just scholarly interpretations, but the fundamental legitimacy claims of institutions that had shaped Western civilization for over 1,000 years. The Catholic Church in particular faced an existential threat from the full revelation of the Meavinian secret. If Jesus had indeed married Mary Magdalene and fathered children, and if those children had founded a dynasty that preserved direct genetic and spiritual connection to the divine, then the Church's role as the sole mediator between humanity and God would be called into question. the implications extended beyond theology into the realm of political authority. Modern European monarchies, democratic governments, even international organizations like the United Nations all derive their legitimacy from principles that had been developed in opposition to the Merovingian understanding of sacred kingship. If that understanding proved to have been correct all along, then the entire basis of contemporary political organization would need to be reconsidered. But perhaps the most profound implications were personal and spiritual. For individuals who had been raised in Christian traditions that emphasized salvation through faith and institutional sacraments, the revelation that divinity might be transmitted through bloodline and direct inheritance represented a fundamental challenge to everything they had been taught about the nature of spiritual authority. As the 21st century progressed, these various pressures created a complex and often contradictory cultural environment. Popular interest in alternative history and ancient mysteries had never been higher. But academic and religious institutions remained largely hostile to research that challenged orthodox interpretations. Mass media provided platforms for discussing radical theories about the past. But those same platforms were often controlled by interests that had reasons to suppress genuine revelations. The preservers of the Merovingian tradition found themselves in a position their predecessors could never have imagined. After 13 centuries of careful concealment, they possessed the technological tools and cultural opportunities necessary to reveal their secret completely. But they also faced opposition from forces that were more sophisticated and better organized than anything previous generations of guardians had encountered. The solution they developed reflected the same subtle wisdom that had allowed their tradition to survive for over a millennium. Rather than attempting a single dramatic revelation that could be suppressed or discredited, they chose to continue their patient strategy of gradual disclosure, but accelerated to match the pace of modern information systems. Multiple research projects in different countries began releasing findings that supported the core claims about Merovingian survival. Independent verification from genetic, archaeological, and documentary sources made it increasingly difficult for skeptics to dismiss the accumulating evidence as coincidence or fraud. Popular culture provided additional channels for introducing general audiences to concepts that prepare them for more complete revelations. By 2020, the cultural landscape had shifted dramatically from what it had been even a generation earlier. Millions of people around the world were familiar with theories about the Holy Grail as bloodline, the survival of Jesus's descendants, and the role of secret societies in preserving ancient traditions. While most of this awareness remained at the level of entertainment and speculation, it had created a foundation of cultural understanding that could support more serious revelations. The COVID-19 pandemic paradoxically accelerated this process of revelation. As billions of people found themselves isolated at home with unprecedented amounts of time for online research, interest in alternative history and conspiracy theories exploded. Academic institutions struggling with budget cuts and enrollment declines became more receptive to unconventional research that could attract public attention and funding. Most importantly, the pandemic demonstrated the fragility of established institutions and the speed with which supposedly stable systems could be transformed by unexpected events. This created a psychological environment in which radical revelations about the past seemed less threatening and more relevant to contemporary concerns. The guardians of the Merovingian tradition recognized that the moment they had been preparing for across 13 centuries had finally arrived. The technological, cultural, and psychological conditions necessary for revealing their complete secret had been achieved. The question was no longer whether to reveal the truth, but how to do so in a way that would maximize understanding, while minimizing the chaos that such revelations might unleash. The answer they developed would prove to be as elegant and sophisticated as anything their predecessors had devised during the long centuries of concealment. But it would also represent something entirely new in the history of their tradition. A complete and final revelation that would transform the hidden dynasty from a carefully guarded secret into a recognized part of human heritage. The Merovingian bloodline was about to emerge from the shadows for the final time. Not as conquerors seeking to reclaim lost thrones, but as teachers offering to share the wisdom they had preserved through the long night of historical suppression. The implications of their emergence would reshape not just our understanding of the past, but our vision of what human civilization might become when guided by principles that had been tested and refined through over 13 centuries of careful preservation. The hidden dynasty was hidden no longer. The sacred bloodline that had shaped European civilization from its earliest foundations was ready to resume its role in guiding humanity toward a future that honored both the ancient wisdom of the past and the unprecedented possibilities of the modern age. The greatest secret in Western history was finally about to be revealed in its complete and authentic form. And nothing would ever be the same again.